Project 944 Part 2. In Part 1 we talked about the 1986 Porsche 944 that I purchased for $400. In this episode I'm going to go over all the problems I had to fix to get it running. Starting with the slave cylinder. The clutch was on the floor when I bought it, so I bought a slave cylinder reseal kit, and the slave cylinder was so seized up that I actually had to replace the entire cylinder. But I got that replaced, and I tried to start the car and it wouldn't start. The fuel gauge was indicating E. I put some fuel in it, the fuel gauge was still indicating E, and it still wouldn't start. I got out of the car and I came around the back because I heard what sounded to be water dripping, and fuel was leaking from the bottom of the tank. Now this cover that covers the fuel pump and fuel line was not was still on the car at the time, so the fuel was leaking from everywhere down. And after I did some research on some fuel tank issues, the early cars had metal tanks which commonly rusted out. So I thought that was my problem, only after I purchased a fuel tank and later discovered that the fuel leak I had was actually this fuel line right here. It looked like it had been melted, some sort of chemical burn. But before that, I had thought I needed to take the tank out, which means I needed to take the transmission out, which is under the fuel tank. So I'd already had about 80% of the transmission disconnected when I discovered the actual problem. So I went ahead and pulled the transmission anyway, and it's kind of helpful that I did that because I was able to get the drain plug removed. I actually had to take it to a machine shop to get that done, and also redid the linkage. I got some short shift linkage from only944.com, and I had that done while the transmission was out. So I replaced the fuel tank, I got the transmission back in, tried to start the car, and it still didn't start. So one of the other common problems on these cars is the DME relay, which is right here, one that says DME relay. So when you start the car, the power from the battery goes to the ignition switch, and then you turn the key, sends power to the starter, which turns the motor at 200 RPM. There's a reference sensor. There's actually two sensors, one that senses top dead center and the other one that sends the RPM signal to the DME, and then to the DME relay, then to the fuel pump. So the fuel pump doesn't even get activated unless it's getting a signal from the computer. So at this point, it's either the DME relay, a wire somewhere in between, the reference sensors, or the DME itself. The DME relay is only about $15 and relatively easy to fix, so I started with that, and that did not solve the problem. So then I stuck power to the fuel pump with the battery directly, and the fuel pump did not work. So then I replaced the fuel pump, and it still did not start. So after that, I was going to change the reference sensors. Now the reference sensors are on the back of the engine block and extremely hard to get to. And this was where most people find themselves having some problems trying to get the reference sensors out. The reference sensors are, if you can see it, which is very hard to see. Here's the wires. These are the wires that come off the back of them, and the sensors are right down there. This light doesn't work very well. There's a bracket, and they drop down into the bell housing. But as you can see, they're very hard to get to. So even if you can get a wrench on them, pulling them out after they've been sitting there for 30 years is very difficult. One of the other problems these cars typically have is the drain on the battery compartment, which is right down here, gets clogged up, and then the water rushes the battery acid off of the car, and you end up with a rusted hole in the bottom of your battery tray. That water proceeds to run inside the passenger footwell, and my light, to where the DME is actually mounted underneath the board. So if you have that problem, there's a chance you're getting water on your DME, in which case you could have a DME problem, which is what I was hoping I really did not have. So it turns out once I replaced the reference sensors, the thing finally started. So my next video, I will show a video, will be about how to easily get your reference sensors out of the car without removing the bracket, which requires re-gapping your sensors, and also without breaking your bracket. So stay tuned for that video.